Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going on a journey today through some thought-provoking articles and transcripts focused on the COVID-19 pandemic. But if you're someone who thinks everything went perfectly during the pandemic, this might not be the deep dive for you.
You got that right. We're diving deep into some alternative perspectives on the pandemic and the lockdown measures. You might find some of these ideas pretty challenging. This stuff comes from a collection of free ebooks. You can find them at tomsfreebooks.com. They were curated by Tom Woods. He's a historian and economist. Oh, and by the way, he was honored with the Hayek Lifetime Achievement Award back in 2019.
Sounds like we've got some interesting stuff to dive into. Let's jump right in with the first ebook. It's called Your Facebook Friends Are Wrong About the Lockdown.
Yeah.
And it introduces this idea of doomers.
Yeah. Think back to the beginning of the pandemic, all that fear and uncertainty. Flatten the curve. That was the initial goal, right?
Right, flatten the curve.
But then the goalposts moved. It suddenly became all about saving even one life, no matter the cost.
Yeah, I remember that.
That created this environment where if you even questioned the lockdowns, it was like you were pro-death. And that's where these doomers come in.
Okay. So who exactly are these doomers?
Yeah.
Are they just people who are, understandably scared? Or is there more to it?
Well, the ebook argues that these folks seem to embrace a very catastrophic view of the virus, and they advocate for never-ending lockdowns, no matter what the costs. It really makes you think, did we go too far, sacrificing our freedoms for the promise of safety?
That's a question a lot of people are asking, even when the pandemic was at its worst. But it felt like you couldn't even bring it up without being labeled, like a granny killer.
Exactly. And the ebook really dives into the consequences of those lockdowns that no one saw coming. For instance, in the UK, cancer deaths actually increased because healthcare resources were shifted away from cancer screenings and treatments.
So wait, we might have caused deaths from other things while trying to save lives from COVID?
Yeah.
That's a hard thing to accept.
It is. And there's more. A UN report actually warned about this. They said that because of economic problems caused by the lockdowns, hundreds of thousands more children could die in 2020.
Wow. It's not just about the virus.
Mm-hmm.
It's about all the unintended consequences of how we responded to it.
And it's global. The U.S. has its own issues. One study estimated that there could be 75,000 deaths of despair because of the unemployment and isolation, all caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns. So it raises this huge question. Should we consider a life with no social interaction, no personal pursuits, and no economic security as truly living?
That's a big question. Are we just trying to live longer no matter what, or are we trying to protect a certain quality of life?
Exactly. And this ebook challenges that listen to the experts idea, the one that was so big during the pandemic.
Right. Listen to the experts.
It's sure, scientists are experts in their own fields. But can we really apply their expertise to decisions about society as a whole? Decisions that have consequences for everyone?
So just because someone knows a lot about viruses doesn't mean they know a lot about, say, economics or how to run a country.
Exactly. Epidemiologists, they're experts in how diseases spread, but are they really qualified to weigh in on the economic and social effects of lockdowns? I don't think so. These are complex problems. We need a broader range of expertise to make these decisions.
Let's move on to the next ebook. The title is a bit, let's just say it's provocative. No one elected Bill Gates, Dr. Fauci, or the infectious disease cartel to perform a social science experiment on the American people. What's the main point here?
This ebook digs into the power and influence of unelected individuals and organizations, in shaping pandemic policies. It specifically targets the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation, or IHME for short.
Okay, the IHME.
They're funded by the Gates Foundation, and they put out those scary projections, predicting way more deaths if states reopen.
I remember those.
Yeah.
They were used all the time to justify keeping lockdowns going, even when other data suggested maybe we didn't need them anymore.
Exactly. And this ebook points out that those projections weren't always right. They emphasize that there wasn't a clear link between how strict the lockdown was and how many people died. For example, some states with really strict lockdowns ended up with similar death rates to states that had no lockdowns at all.
So it wasn't as straightforward as lockdowns work or lockdowns don't work?
Right. The ebook actually uses California as an example. They had a really tough lockdown, but their death rate wasn't that different from states like Iowa, which didn't have a lockdown at all. And then it gets even more interesting. The ebook examines New York State and finds big differences in death rates within the state itself.
So within New York State, were lockdowns the deciding factor there?
Well, densely populated places, like the Bronx, had much higher death rates than less populated areas.
Yeah.
What does that tell us? It suggests that things like age, overall health, and how many people live in an area might have mattered more than the lockdowns themselves. We have to look at the specifics, not just accept a one-size-fits-all story.
So, this ebook is saying that lockdowns might not have been as effective as we were told, and that other factors were more important, which goes back to what we were talking about before, about questioning the experts, right?
Absolutely. It's not about saying experts are always wrong. It's about recognizing that they don't have all the answers. And we need to think critically, even when experts are involved. We need to ask questions, look at the data, and consider all sides of the story.
And that brings us to our next ebook. It's called The Three Nations of COVID and a Windbag Named Fauci. This Three Nations of COVID idea, I'm intrigued. What is that all about?
So this ebook breaks down the U.S. population into three groups based on their risk from COVID. First, you have Kids Nation. That's everyone under 15. Their risk of dying from COVID was almost zero.
Kids Nation, okay.
Then there's Parents Workers Nation. That's the 15 to 64 group. Their risk was low compared to, regular death rates.
Got it.
And finally, we have Great-Grandparents Nation, those 65 and older. Their risk was much higher, especially those over 85 and with pre-existing health issues.
So the point is, the risk wasn't the same for everyone.
Exactly. And with this framework, you really see how a one-size-fits-all lockdown approach might have been a mistake. The ebook argues that it really hurt Parents Workers Nation, the people who keep society running, right? While offering very little extra protection to those who are truly vulnerable.
So instead of shutting down everything, maybe it would have been better to focus on protecting the most vulnerable.
That's what the ebook is suggesting. It highlights this case with New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio. He went after the Orthodox Jewish community because they held a large funeral during the pandemic.
I remember that. It was quite controversial.
The ebook points out that very few people at that funeral seemed to be high risk, but the mayor still threatened them with legal action.
Seems a bit like an overreaction, maybe. Prioritizing appearances over actually understanding the risk.
Right. And the ebook also brings up something else. The 1957 Asian flu pandemic.
The Asian flu, okay.
The death rate was actually higher than for COVID-19, but there were no lockdowns. Makes you wonder, was our response to COVID really proportional to the threat?
Maybe we were operating out of fear, and that fear led to decisions that, looking back, seem a bit extreme.
Now, let's move on to the next ebook. It's a protest from France. This one challenges the idea that the pandemic was like a war. Remember how often we heard that? We're at war with the virus.
Oh, yeah. It was everywhere, like we were being rallied to fight this invisible enemy.
The ebook asks, is it really a war? There's no enemy you can see, no battlefield, no chance of winning in the traditional sense. Was that just rhetoric to justify policies that might have been harder to get people to accept in normal times?
It's a good point. Maybe that language was used to make us feel like we had to accept things we wouldn't normally.
Exactly. The ebook argues that this whole wartime framing was a way to infringe on civil liberties and economic freedoms. It makes you question how much power the government should have during a crisis.
So basically using a crisis to do things that wouldn't be okay under normal circumstances.
This ebook also points out the inconsistencies in that save lives at all costs argument.
Okay.
It compares the pandemic response to policies like abortion, where the lives of the unborn don't seem to matter as much.
That makes you think, doesn't it? It suggests that this idea of the value of life can be pretty selective, depending on the political agenda.
This next part gets a little complex, but stick with me. The ebook dives into the limitations of scientific knowledge. Like, how useful is science when it comes to solving complicated social problems?
Break it down for me.
Okay, science is great at figuring out how things work, but it's not always so good at telling us what to do. This ebook suggests that blindly following the experts during the pandemic, maybe that wasn't the best approach.
Because even experts can get things wrong.
Oh.
Or they can be biased. Or influenced by politics.
Exactly. The ebook points out that experts, especially those working for the government, can have their own agendas. They don't always have all the experience or knowledge to deal with these kinds of messy situations.
So even when experts are involved, we still need to think critically.
Absolutely. And we have to realize that there are always trade-offs with any policy decision. There's no perfect solution.
It makes me think about what we discussed earlier, the unintended consequences of lockdowns.
Yeah.
It seems like we were so focused on just the virus itself that we didn't really consider all the other impacts of our actions.
You're right. And this ebook emphasizes how important individual freedom is when it comes to problem solving. They argue that lockdowns, by stifling economic activity and individual initiative, might have actually made things worse.
So maybe if we had allowed people and businesses to adapt and innovate, of course within some responsible guidelines, maybe we could have come up with better solutions.
That's the argument, yeah. It suggests that a more decentralized approach, one that empowers individuals instead of relying on top-down orders, might have been better in the long run.
Okay, next up we've got the economics of COVID-19 and the state response. I have a feeling you're going to enjoy this one.
This ebook dives right into the economic mess caused by the pandemic and how the government reacted to it. It questions whether the government can really decide which businesses are essential and which ones aren't.
That was a big deal during the pandemic.
Yeah.
So many businesses and people were confused by those classifications.
Oh, totally. And the ebook says it's not that simple. You can't just shut down parts of the economy without it affecting everything else. Everything's connected.
Right.
Shutting down businesses that were deemed non-essential had all these unintended consequences. It disrupted supply chains and messed up whole sectors of the economy.
It wasn't like you could just flip a switch and turn off certain parts of the economy without anything else happening.
Exactly. And this ebook gets into how lockdowns really hurt small businesses and how big corporations like Amazon actually benefited from all of this.
Yeah. It felt like the pandemic gave an advantage to the big guys.
Right. And the ebook is critical of the bailouts the government gave to businesses. It argues that they often reward bad management, and they prevent what economists call creative destruction from doing its thing.
Creative destruction.
Yeah. When businesses are allowed to fail, it opens up space for new, innovative businesses to come in and make things better.
So sometimes it's better to let the market work things out on its own, even if it's tough in the short term.
Exactly. The ebook acknowledges that a lot of businesses operate on borrowed money, and they might not be prepared for tough times, but it points out that the current system encourages them to do that. It's easy to get cheap credit, so businesses take on more risk than they probably should.
Instead of blaming businesses for not being prepared, maybe we should look at the bigger picture.
You got it. Now, this next part might sound a little technical, but I'll try to make it clear. The ebook compares the recession we're in now, which was caused by a supply shock, to a recession caused by what's called an Austrian business cycle. Imagine the economy as a giant Jenga tower, okay?
Okay, I can picture that.
A supply shock is like someone suddenly pulling out a bunch of blocks from the middle of the tower. Suddenly, the whole thing is unstable.
Gotcha. So how is that different from an Austrian business cycle?
An Austrian business cycle is more like someone slowly adding blocks to the tower that don't quite fit. The whole thing gets more and more wobbly over time. Eventually, even a small bump can make the whole thing crash down.
So with an Austrian business cycle, the problems build up slowly.
Yeah.
Because of distortions in the market, like easy credit and bad investments. Whereas with COVID, the recession was triggered by a sudden shock to the system.
Exactly. And this shows how the current crisis is unique. It wasn't a typical boom and bust. It was the sudden disruption caused by the pandemic and how we responded to it.
Makes sense. That leads us to our next ebook. It's called COVID-19, The Lockdowns, and Human Flourishing. What's the main idea here?
This ebook challenges this idea that the government's main job is to prevent deaths at any cost. It says that protecting individual freedom should be the top priority. It's not just about living a long life. It's about living a good life, a life worth living.
Yeah, that was a big debate during the pandemic. Safety versus freedom.
Right. And the ebook says that when we focus too much on eliminating one specific risk, like COVID-19 in this case, we end up ignoring or even making other risks worse. It's about finding a balance, not obsessing over a single threat.
So it's important to acknowledge that there are costs associated with every policy, and we have to think carefully about those costs.
Exactly. The ebook discusses the trade-offs that came with lockdown policies, weighing the possible reduction in COVID deaths against the disruptions to people's livelihoods, their mental well-being, and the long-term economic outlook. We have to recognize that life is about more than just avoiding death.
And it brings up this powerful concept, this idea of living death. What does that mean exactly?
The ebook paints a pretty bleak picture of the future, one where fear and isolation dominate everything, and our quality of life is just diminished. It's a warning about the possibility of a world where we're always afraid of the next crisis, where our freedoms are slowly taken away in the name of safety, where we might physically be alive, but our spirits are crushed.
That's a scary thought. Maybe in trying to protect ourselves from death, we've accidentally created a world where it's hard to really live there.
Yeah, it's the question the ebook is asking us to think about. It reminds us that there's more to life than just surviving. Joy, connection, purpose, freedom, these things are worth fighting for.
This brings us to our final ebook for this part of the deep dive. It's called What Governors Can Do. Sounds like it's going to offer some concrete solutions. Tell me more.
This ebook proposes a state-level approach to managing pandemics, maybe led by a bunch of like-minded governors. It's about pushing back against a one-size-fits-all federal approach and giving states more control.
So more localized decision-making. That's interesting.
Right. The ebook argues that states are closer to the people. They understand the specific needs of their communities better. It suggests a set of guidelines that prioritize individual choice and responsibility, instead of relying on government mandates.
Can you give me some examples of what those guidelines might look like?
Sure. The ebook suggests encouraging self-quarantine for the elderly and vulnerable, but not making it mandatory for everyone. It recommends mask wearing, especially for healthy people. But again, no mandates. It's about giving people information and letting them make their own choices, based on their own risk assessments.
So a more flexible approach, one that respects individual autonomy.
Exactly. Another idea is allowing businesses to operate, but holding them liable if it can be proven that the virus spread there. So businesses can stay open, but they're responsible for keeping people safe.
That's a completely different approach from what we saw during the pandemic. Back then, businesses were often forced to close, whether or not they posed a real risk.
Right. And when it comes to financial assistance, this ebook suggests using state-issued bonds backed by government assets. That way, taxpayers aren't left footing the bill. It's about being creative and not just printing more money or racking up more national debt.
Definitely a different way of thinking about economic policy.
And finally, the ebook talks about prioritizing access to promising treatments, even if they haven't gone through the whole FDA approval process.
I remember that being a big debate during the pandemic.
It's about weighing the potential benefits against the risks and making decisions based on the best information we have, even if it's not perfect.
Makes sense.
The ebook ends by saying that maybe this crisis could lead to a reassessment of federalism, the balance of power between the states and the federal government, and how state governments can protect individual liberties.
That's an interesting idea. Maybe the pandemic, as difficult as it was, could be a chance to shift power away from the federal government and back to the states. It's a good reminder that things don't have to stay the way they are.
We can challenge the system, demand more freedom, and create a future where individual liberty is protected. And all of these ideas, this whole conversation, it all comes from just a handful of ebooks. And they're all free at tomsfreebooks.com. Just imagine what other thought-provoking ideas are out there waiting to be discovered. It's definitely worth checking out.
Absolutely. We'll be back after a short break to keep going with our deep dive. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Before the break, we were really digging into some thought-provoking ideas about the pandemic and how society responded. If you're just joining us now, we're taking a look at some alternative perspectives, ideas that challenge the usual way of thinking about things. We're getting these insights from a collection of free ebooks curated by Tom Woods, which you can find at tomsfreebooks.com.
All this talk about individual freedom and the government's role, it makes you really think about, the balance of power. Did we go too far, towards centralized control during the pandemic?
That's a big question a lot of people are wrestling with. And it's something that this next ebook, COVID-19 and the Great Reset, explores in depth.
Okay, the Great Reset. I've heard that phrase before, but I'm not sure I fully understand it. Can you break it down for me?
Sure. The Great Reset has been around for a while, but it really took off during the pandemic. It's basically a call for a total restructuring of the global economy and society.
Whoa, a total restructuring. That's a pretty big idea.
It is. The idea is that the pandemic showed us all the flaws in our current systems, and we need to take this chance to build back better.
So it's about using this crisis as a catalyst for change. But what kind of change are we talking about?
That's where it gets a bit complicated. The people pushing for the Great Reset, they come from all walks of life. Business leaders, politicians, academics, even celebrities. And they don't always agree on what this reset should look like.
Makes sense. It's such a big concept. It's bound to be interpreted in a lot of different ways.
Right. But there are some common threads. A lot of the proponents talk about a more sustainable and equitable economy, one that puts social justice and environmental protection first. They talk about things like green energy, universal basic income. stakeholder capitalism.
Those sound like progressive ideas. So what's the controversy? Why is this ebook critical of the Great Reset?
The ebook says that while some of the goals of the Great Reset might be good, the methods they're using to achieve those goals are concerning. It raises concerns about the concentration of power in the hands of unelected elites, the erosion of individual liberty, and the potential for technocratic control over our lives.
So it's not necessarily about the goals themselves, but it's about who's in charge and what their real motivations are. Are they really trying to make the world a better place? Or are they using this crisis to grab more power and influence for themselves?
That's the question this ebook is asking us to think about. We need to look past the nice words and see the power dynamics at play.
Yeah, it's easy to get swept up in all the talk about building back better. But we need to ask ourselves, who really benefits from these changes? Who might get left behind?
Exactly. The ebook argues that the Great Reset, as it's being presented right now, could lead to a more centralized, technocratic system, a world where individuals have less control over their own lives.
So instead of empowering people, it could actually take away their autonomy and agency.
That's the warning. The ebook encourages us to be skeptical of these utopian visions, especially when they're coming from people who already have a lot of power and influence.
It's like we need to question who benefits from these grand plans.
Yeah.
And be wary of solutions that seem too good to be true.
Now, this next ebook, Face Masks, Much More Than You Wanted to Know, takes a close look at a very specific part of the pandemic response: mask mandates.
Masks. This is a controversial topic. Even though it's been years since the mandates were lifted, I still see people wearing them everywhere.
It's definitely something that evokes strong opinions. This ebook examines the science, the history, and the politics of masks, and it presents a more balanced view than you might find in the mainstream media.
Okay, so let's break it down. What does it have to say about the science behind masks?
Well, the ebook acknowledges that there's some evidence that masks can reduce the spread of respiratory droplets. But it also points out that the evidence isn't as conclusive as many believe.
So it's not as simple as masks work or masks don't work. There are nuances.
Right. The effectiveness of masks depends on a lot of things: the type of mask, how it's worn, where you are, how people are behaving. And the ebook argues that a lot of the research on masks has been flawed or inconclusive.
So there's a lot of uncertainty. And maybe we were too quick to accept masks as a simple solution.
The ebook also digs into the history of masks. It turns out they've been used for centuries, for all sorts of reasons: religious ceremonies, medical procedures, industrial safety, even fashion. It makes you wonder if this current obsession with masks is partly due to our anxiety about the pandemic and our desire to feel like we have some control over the situation.
That's an interesting perspective. It's not just about the science itself. It's about the psychology and the symbolism of masks.
Right. And then there's the political side of things. The ebook suggests that masks have become a symbol of compliance and conformity. It argues that mask mandates, in some cases, were more about virtue signaling and social control than public health.
So wearing a mask became a way to show that you were taking the pandemic seriously, that you were a good citizen.
Exactly. And the ebook argues that this kind of virtue signaling can be dangerous. It can shut down critical thinking and prevent open debate. It creates an atmosphere where anyone who questions the effectiveness or necessity of masks is labeled a denier or a science skeptic.
It's about suppressing dissent, even when there's legitimate uncertainty about the science.
Now, what about the people who genuinely believe that masks are necessary and effective? Are they just sheep blindly following the crowd?
It's easy to dismiss people who disagree with us as uninformed or misled, but we should try to understand their perspective, right?
Absolutely. And the ebook acknowledges that many people, especially those who are vulnerable or have health conditions, might feel safer wearing masks. It's about respecting those individual choices, even if we don't personally agree with them.
So it's not about dictating what people should do. It's about giving them information so they can make your own informed decisions.
Exactly. And that brings us to the core message of this ebook: individual liberty. The right to make choices about our own bodies and our own health.
That connects back to the main theme we've been discussing throughout this deep dive: the balance between keeping everyone safe and respecting individual freedom.
Right. And the ebook argues that the balance has tipped too far towards collective safety and individual freedom has suffered. It's a reminder that we shouldn't give up our fundamental freedoms in exchange for security.
It's a powerful message. Now, tell me about this next one: the truth about vitamin D and COVID-19. This sounds intriguing.
This ebook dives into something that didn't get much attention during the pandemic: The role of vitamin D in boosting our immune systems. It challenges the mainstream view that focused almost exclusively on vaccines and masks as the primary ways to prevent and treat COVID-19.
So it's about looking beyond the conventional wisdom and exploring alternative approaches to health and wellness.
Exactly. The ebook makes a strong case for the importance of vitamin D in protecting against respiratory infections, including COVID-19. It cites lots of studies that show a clear link between vitamin D deficiency and a higher risk of getting really sick from COVID-19.
So it's not just about treating COVID-19, it's about strengthening our immune systems in general to be more resistant to all kinds of infections.
Precisely. The ebook argues that maintaining healthy levels of vitamin D can make our immune system stronger, which means we're less likely to get sick. It also explains how vitamin D works on a molecular level, how it regulates our immune responses and helps our bodies fight off those nasty pathogens.
This is fascinating. It seems like something that should have been discussed more during the pandemic. Why do you think vitamin D was largely ignored?
The ebook offers some possible explanations. For one, vitamin D is easily accessible and affordable. There's not a lot of profit to be made from promoting it.
So it's about the money then.
It could be. Also, vitamin D is a natural substance, not a pharmaceutical drug. And the pharmaceutical industry has a huge influence over medical research and public health policy.
So it's about understanding who's controlling the narrative and what their motivations might be.
Right. We need to be critical thinkers when it comes to health information. Don't just blindly accept what you're told. Do your own research and get information from a variety of sources. This ebook is a great resource for anyone who wants to learn more about vitamin D and its benefits.
So far, we've covered doomers, the Great Reset, the science and politics of masks, and the power of vitamin D. What else is in store for us in these ebooks?
Well, up next, we have The Politics of COVID-19. This one dives into how the pandemic was used to push various political agendas. It takes a deep look at power struggles, media narratives, and the social divisions that shaped our experience of the pandemic.
It definitely felt like the pandemic became this super politicized event where everything was seen as us versus them.
Absolutely. And this ebook unpacks that dynamic. It explores how the pandemic was used to demonize opponents, censor information, and expand government power. It looks at how fear and uncertainty were weaponized to manipulate public opinion and push certain ideologies.
So it's about recognizing how crises can be exploited to reshape the political landscape.
Exactly. And we need to be aware of this because it could happen again. Whenever there's a major crisis, there will always be people who try to take advantage of it for their own benefit. It's up to us to stay vigilant and resist any attempts to erode our freedoms.
So we need to be informed, think critically, and stand up for our principles, even when it's hard.
And speaking of standing up for our principles, the next ebook, The Case for Civil Disobedience, explores the moral and philosophical reasons for resisting unjust laws and policies.
Okay, civil disobedience. That's a powerful idea. But isn't it kind of dangerous? Doesn't it lead to chaos and anarchy?
The ebook tackles those concerns head-on. It argues that civil disobedience is not about mindless rebellion or violence. It's about a principled, nonviolent resistance to laws and policies that go against our fundamental rights.
So it's about understanding the difference between just and unjust laws and taking a stand when your conscience tells you to.
Exactly. The ebook argues that civil disobedience has been essential for social progress throughout history. Think of figures like Socrates, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. They all challenged the status quo, spoke truth to power, and demanded a more just society.
It's inspiring to think about all the brave people who have risked everything to stand up for what they believe in.
And this ebook encourages us to think about how we can practice civil disobedience in our own lives, even in small ways. It's about finding our voices, taking action, and making a difference.
So it's not always about big, dramatic protests. It can also be about the everyday choices we make, how we interact with authority, and having the courage to speak out when something is wrong.
Now let's move on to the economic consequences of the lockdown. This one delves into the long-term economic fallout from the pandemic and the policies that were put in place to deal with it.
This one might be a bit of a downer. It feels like we're still dealing with the economic consequences of the pandemic, even years later.
You're not wrong. The economic impact has been massive and far-reaching, and this ebook argues that we're just beginning to see the true extent of the damage. It explores how lockdowns, business closures, and government spending have messed up supply chains, distorted markets, and caused inflation.
So it's not just about the immediate financial hardship that people faced during the pandemic. It's about these long-term structural changes that are still affecting the economy today.
Exactly. And the ebook argues that a lot of the policies put in place during the pandemic have actually made things worse. It criticizes the massive government spending, the printing of money, and the bailouts, saying that they've created financial instability and a situation where people are encouraged to take risks because they know they'll be bailed out.
Okay, can you explain that a bit more? What's the problem with government spending and bailouts?
Sure, the ebook says that when the government spends more money than it brings in, it has to either borrow the difference or print more money. Borrowing leads to higher interest rates, which makes it harder for businesses to invest and grow the economy. And printing more money can cause inflation, which makes everything more expensive and erodes the value of our savings.
So even well-intentioned policies can have unintended negative consequences.
Exactly. And the ebook is critical of bailouts, arguing that they often reward irresponsible behavior and prevent the natural process of creative destruction from working. When businesses are allowed to fail, it creates opportunities for new, more innovative businesses to emerge.
It's about letting the market do its job, even if it means some short-term pain.
Right. The ebook argues that the bailouts during the pandemic created a system where businesses are encouraged to take more risks, knowing that the government will come to their rescue if things go wrong.
It creates a dangerous cycle of dependency and reckless risk-taking.
And this ebook warns that we're on a path towards a major economic crisis. The combination of massive debt, inflation, and distorted markets has created a very risky situation.
That's not a happy thought. What can we do to avoid this potential crisis?
The ebook argues that we need to change direction, reduce government spending, stop printing money, and let the market correct itself. We need to get back to sound economic principles, even if it means making tough choices in the short term.
It's about thinking long-term and recognizing that we can't just keep spending money we don't have.
Now let's talk about COVID-19 and the future of freedom. This ebook takes a broader look at the implications of the pandemic for individual liberty and the role of government in our lives.
I'm sensing a theme here. It seems like a lot of these ebooks are worried about the loss of freedom after the pandemic.
You're right. This ebook argues that the pandemic has sped up trends that were already happening, like the rise of surveillance technologies, the expansion of government power, and the decline of individual responsibility.
It's like crises can be used as an excuse to implement measures that would never be accepted in normal times.
Exactly. We need to be very careful about protecting our freedoms, even when it's difficult. Freedom is not something we can take for granted. It's something we have to constantly fight for and defend.
The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Well said. This ebook encourages us to stay informed, engage in constructive dialogue, and hold our leaders accountable. It's about taking back control of our lives and shaping the future we want to see.
So it's not about giving up. It's about empowering ourselves. It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we respond to these challenges.
And that leads us to the final ebook for this section, The Great Reopening.
Okay, the Great Reopening. That sounds a bit more optimistic. Tell me about it.
This ebook offers a roadmap for rebuilding our lives and communities in the aftermath of the pandemic. It's about embracing resilience, innovation, and optimism. It's about moving past the fear and uncertainty that have held us captive for so long and seeing the opportunities that lie ahead.
So it's a call to action, a reminder that we can create a better future if we work together.
Exactly. And the ebook gives us practical advice on how to do just that. It talks about supporting small businesses, encouraging entrepreneurship, and promoting individual initiative. It encourages us to rebuild our communities, strengthen our relationships, and focus on what truly matters.
It's about taking back our lives and building a future that reflects our values.
And remember, we're not alone in this. There are millions of people around the world who also want a better future. This ebook is about connecting with those people, building networks of support, and working together to create a world that's more just, more sustainable, and more free.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been through quite a journey today, exploring all these different perspectives on the pandemic and what it's done to, well, everything.
From doomers to the Great Reset, from those mask mandates to, the whole vitamin D thing. We've covered a lot. And it all boils down to one big question. What does freedom even mean in a world that's facing all these unprecedented challenges?
Reading through all these ebooks, it really struck me like something fundamental changed during the pandemic. And we're still trying to figure out, what it all means.
I think you've hit the nail on the head. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a societal crisis. It forced us to ask some really basic questions about the role of government, about what freedom really means, about the balance between, individual rights and the well-being of society as a whole.
And those questions, they don't have easy answers. It feels like we're in uncharted territory, trying to find our way in a world that's been, well, completely transformed.
That's exactly why these alternative perspectives are so important. They challenge the official narrative. They get us thinking critically. They encourage us to question the status quo. We don't have to just accept things the way they are. We have the power to shape our own future.
I hear you. But it's easy to feel helpless. Like, what can one person really do in the face of such huge systemic problems? How can we actually create a better future?
That's a question we all struggle with. And these ebooks, I think they offer some practical guidance. They remind us that change starts small, in our own communities, in the choices we make every
So
day.
focus on what we can control and take action in our own little corner of the world.
Exactly. We can support those local businesses. We can engage in, civil and productive conversations. We can hold our elected officials accountable, educate ourselves and others,
Mhm.
and make choices that, align with our values.
And maybe most importantly, don't give in to fear and despair. Choose hope. Choose resilience. Believe in our ability to make a difference.
That's where the real power is. In our ability, individually and collectively, to imagine a better future and then, actually create it. These ebooks, they don't have all the answers, but they do give us tools, insights, and a sense of possibility.
That's a great point. The most important takeaway from this deep dive is that we're not powerless. We have a choice in how we respond to these challenges.
So go check out these ebooks. They're all free at tomsfreebooks.com. Dive in, explore the ideas that speak to you, challenge your own assumptions, have those meaningful conversations.
Because at the end of the day, the future isn't something that just happens to us. It's something we build together.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's made you curious, challenged your thinking, and, inspired you to take some action. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Keep questioning, keep learning, keep diving deep.